Welcome, everyone. It is Saturday, April the 18th, and it's 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. My name is Dr. Shelley Viola Murphy, and thank you for joining us with the International African American Museum Center for Family History monthly podcast. We're honored to gather in this space once dedicated to truth, memory, and recovery of stories that were too often ignored or erased. Today's conversation will be recorded as part of our podcast series. So we're especially grateful to our live audience for being part of this moment. Your presence matters because this history is not abstract. It lives in families, names, records, and questions that we continue to ask. I'm hearing a lot of feedback. I'm in an empty room all by myself, so I don't know where the feedback is coming from. So I'm just mentioning that in case other folks are hearing it as well. So today's discussion is going to be beyond the Trail of Tears, untold lives, lost records, and living descendants. When many people hear the phrase Trail of Tears, they think of a single march, a single people, a story that begins and ends in the 1830s, and so forth. But the reality is, it's more complex than that. So today we're going to discuss with two fabulous guests. And so, Terry Ligon, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background.
Interesting. As you say, Terry Ligon, but that's Ligon in Oklahoma and Texas. And in California, I'm Terry Ligon. Okay. My background is 4 decades of researching Indian Territory freedmen. I focused a lot on Chickasaws and Choctaw freedmen and their history. I covered the congressional record, a legal case that involved my great grandmother, and I'm a founding member of the African American Genealogical Society of Northern California, as well as the Choctaw Freedmen Association. So that's pretty much me in a nutshell. Presently, I'm getting ready to publish my book, Enslaved on the Trail of Tears. It comes out on May the 26th this year, but a little over a month. And hopefully, like you say, we're going to bring together some stories that are not normally heard, identified, and restore them to the history of the 5 slaveholding tribes.
Beautiful. Angela, introduce yourself.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning for those out west. My name is Angela Walton Raji, and like Terry, I've spent the last several decades researching individuals coming from Indian Territory. My ancestors are from the Choctaw Nation, and I have particularly become interested in recording that history. I have authored several books. My latest book to be released in 10 days on April 28th, which will be, by the way, the 160th anniversary of the signing of the Treaty of 1866, signed by Choctaw and Chickasaw nations. I am one of the older founding members of the old Afrogenius website, which is no longer online. I'm also founding member of CCFA, the Choctaw Chickasaw Freedmen Association. And I am just delighted to be here and thrilled to be here with my colleague Terry, who's written a landmark book. Usually when people make references, even scholars, in terms of the migration, the Trail of Tears, it sometimes becomes just a Cherokee story, or if they mention the other 4 nations, those who were enslaved on the trail are a mere footnote. But Terry has done some remarkable research. He's identified several hundred people by name in terms of what they went through. Absolutely. Good to be here. Thank you.
Well, I will tell you, I have pre-ordered both of your books, and one of them just shipped. I don't know which one, but I saw the email come through that one of those 2 books just shipped. So I'm excited.
Because I've gotten my author copies. And
okay. And Terry got his author copies too, I believe. Not yet, Terry.
His is in
I
May.
received my
So.
tiny
So
book.
then your book is the one that shipped. So I'm excited. So let's get this rolling. So one of the reasons that I thought this was a good topic for discussion is because when people hear about the Trail of Tears, what do you think are the most common myths or oversimplifications that they encounter when they just hear the term Trail of Tears? And Angela, I'll go with you first.
I think many people think of, number one, the removal of just one nation. Oftentimes, people will sort of make a very broad reference to it, and they think primarily of Cherokees. But the Cherokees weren't even the very first people to remove. Choctaws were, and they removed after the signing of the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit in 1830, and they were the first to arrive in the West, coming, across the Mississippi into the new territory being established for them. But that mistake is often made, it's Cherokees. But no, there were 5 tribes that were slaveholding tribes that removed along with enslaved people who are more than a footnote. And thanks to Terry, we now can say their names.
Why do you all think, and I'm going to look at Terry for this, why do you think these myths have been so persistent in textbooks and in public memory? Because we got confusion.
I think the easy answer is that we don't own our own narrative. The stories that have been told by the types, and they're telling it from their point of view. I guess being the victim, being the hero, all of that story is based upon what they have written. And because our ancestors were illiterate, they didn't keep journals on their trail. They didn't live to tell that story. We get it through fragments of testimony by their descendants. And if we're lucky, we'll find 1 or 2 who actually were on the trail and gave us a first-person account. But it's rare, and I hope that based on my research, other research will start to emerge that can find those hidden gems that will give us a story about what occurred to our people on that trail. But as long as we don't own our narrative, our story won't be told.
So I'm going to make a point here. One of the reasons this conversation belongs here at the International African American Museum is because the Trail of Tears was not experienced just by Native people. So who else is out there with the Native people during the Trail of Tears?
Oh, the
Go ahead,
records,
Terry.
the records that I've come across clearly point to the participation of African descendant people. Majority of them were enslaved. You have a few, and I mean a very few, who were considered to be free. But that's a relative term, and you have to kind of dig deep into the weeds to figure out what that freedom entails. But along with them, in all the records, all the census records from the early 1820s, when some of the first people were traveling west to immigrate across the Mississippi, you find African descendant people with them. In the 1830s, when the census was created, especially with the Chickasaw and the Cherokee, you find African descendant people with them as numbers or tick marks. So the evidence is clear. They did not come alone, but when the story is told, that's the only story you hear.
And Angela, you want to comment on this as well?
Yes, I think one of the things that happens, and that's happened, of course, many years and in many different regions of the country, is that placing people of color, particularly people of African descent, into an invisible category. If we get mentioned in, history books, we're a footnote, especially when it comes to this particular topic. And in addition, there's another element where it's sort of erased from our memory by design. After statehood, the very first bill, statehood occurred in the state of Oklahoma in 1907. Senate Bill number 1 of the new legislature of the brand new state was to separate the races. Now, 5 tribal nations with different identities, because for several generations, these people had now been living within their tribal community. And suddenly, through just the stroke of a pen, signing into law, you are all you Negroes, get to the back of the bus. We couldn't care. Oh, you're a Cherokee, doesn't matter. You're a Negro, get to the back. As one of our colleagues says that she remembers her grandfather saying, Hatakalusa, meaning, oh, you're just a Negro, get to the back. And so there's erasure. And because of that erasure is one reason why many have not, if they've looked at the historical record, they've only seen part of the record, which is why Terry, who's looking at the same record, has been able to bring these names forward. And of course, people who go through trauma, whether it's enslavement, whether it's a forced removal, usually they're not going to talk about that trauma to their children, their grandchildren. Many people know from the 20th century, many people who endured the Holocaust from World War II. They didn't talk about it to their children. They did not want to pass that trauma down. Well, enslaved people did not want to pass their trauma down. So add to that, avoiding trauma to the children and grandchildren, and then a state created a brand new system of education, didn't address slavery, didn't address the presence of Black people on the forced migration of the Indian removal. So there's that invisible result. And we became invisible to the larger population and sadly invisible to ourselves until some of us who were curious enough to get into the records and went, oh my God, now I understand why my great-grandmother Sally said certain things or avoided certain things.
So question here, and I still want to clarify, just who are the people that are being removed? Are they enslaved and free and Native American all together? And where are they coming from? And we know they're heading to Indian Territory. Can you both respond to that?
Terry, take it first. We can't hear you, Terry.
I was choking. I had to turn myself off.
That's okay. You're a family.
The people who came west did comprise the enslaved and native. And it also has to be pointed out that the enslaved came with an elite group of people, the slave owners, the people who were the movers and shakers, the people, in the case of the Chickasaws, negotiated their removal and were paid to come west. Okay, so they did it under their own resources. Those people who came with them cleared the path for them and made it possible for them to reinvigorate their nation, rebuild it in the West. And so what you have is a group of people who are tied to the culture, to the language, to the land. Yet again, when we're talking about enslaved people, we're always being dismissed or omitted from having any possibility of being part of that culture in that land. When the enslaved women were sexually molested enough to bear the children of these men. And so they lived with that scar and that attention, and they brought those children west with them as well. So you can't separate them, even though the history says the races were separated, but as a whole, they came together as one. You can get into later on. I think one of the census records for the Cherokees, I hope I sent it to you as a slide, where you look at some of the way they describe that population. And it's really interesting and intriguing how they define people, how they identify people. And that might go a little bit more to the core of your question.
Which is interesting. And Angela, before you respond, what's interesting, genealogical research, we're still seeing that. And not even involved with the Trail of Tears and during this time. We're still facing that challenge. So go ahead, Angela.
No, I was going to respond in terms of the part of your question, in terms of who are they, where were they coming from? The 5 tribes were Southerners. Understand the ancestral homeland, particularly the Choctaw, Mississippi, Chickasaw, Mississippi, Muscogee people, originally Alabama, some of whom had migrated into Florida through several conflicts. But these are Southerners. They were also labeled by the colonizers as the 5 civilized tribes, as opposed to uncivilized. What is a civilized tribe?
What
What does
does
that
that
mean?
mean?
Right. Well, it meant that they were adopting some of the customs and
Customs.
lifestyle habits of the colonizers. Many became Christian. Many became agrarian farmers. They changed their method of acquiring food for their population. And what was the tool of the day if you were a farmer and a very large farmer? Well, they didn't have the John Deere tractors. They had enslaved people to clear the land, to plow the fields, to pick the crops. And so as Southerners in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, they, of course, went west. They took their property with them, whether it was maybe a few heads of livestock, baskets, clothing, blankets, and enslaved people who were also among their property. And thankfully, there are documents that indicate who these people are. There are also narratives that remain from different types of oral histories that were collected in the 1930s. I'm not referring specifically to the WPA slave narratives. I'm referring specifically to the Indian pioneer papers, of which there are 16 or 18 volumes of oral histories, some of whom were freedmen descended and were telling who migrated with whom. We came west with the Indians, and they would talk about that. Also, other records in the Dawes interviews, you find some when they're asked, well, who are you? Where were you born? And they'll say, oh, I came here with my master's family, and they were Chickasaws or they were Muscogee people. So thankfully, we have that information. But ancestrally, they came from Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, Southern California, Carolina, and Florida. So they were.
What about Virginia? The
They were
Virginia.
not. The Virginia
Okay.
tribes were not part of the Indian removal.
But
And-
you can
and-
include Tennessee.
Tennessee.
And they traveled
Georgia,
through
Florida.
Tennessee. Absolutely,
Right.
yes.
Okay.
But
And who
ancestral-
ordered this removal?
Well, the Indian removal certainly was ordered early on in the 1800s when it was decided we've got to clear this land and push these folks away. And, excuse me. And each tribe signed different treaties with the U.S. government. The earliest of those treaties being the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, signed with the Choctaws, and of course they were the first to remove in that winter of 1830 and 31. In fact, the expression Trail of Tears came from the Choctaw removal, although it morphed into Trail of Tears. Many of the leaders, because there was so much loss of life and such a difficulty in making that journey, it was referred to as the trail where we cried, because every day, and of course, keep in mind the death and burial customs within many of the nations. And this actually was beyond just one tribal community, but there was the tradition of holding the cry when you go and cry for days over the grave
Right.
of your loved one. And many times they could not stop and cry. They had to keep moving. They only moved about 12 to 15 miles per day as they were moving, and some walking, some in wagons, some on mule or horseback. But having to bury a loved one who had just died, accidents, children falling off a wagon, getting crushed by a wagon, what have you. And some of those children who
you just
died
went mute.
were Black.
You just went mute for me.
Can you hear me
It
now?
blinked.
I can hear you.
You can
Okay.
hear me? Okay, you're
Yes.
back.
Okay, sorry about that. But there were children, and there were Black children who died. I know from one of the oral history narratives, it was a little Black child who had fallen off the wagon, crushed by a wagon wheel, who died.
Wow.
They could not, and keep in mind, these enslaved people, they had been immersed in the tribal culture. They did not have the luxury of being able to weep, to cry. They had to bury the dead and keep moving.
Keep going.
And so the tradition of the traditional cry was taken from them. And then, of course, for the rest of the century, up until Oklahoma statehood, this was still the tribal tradition in which they lived and in which they were immersed.
So Brian had a question. Were the survivors ever interviewed? And I know some of this might link to Terry's book, by the WPA or some other method, or what was going on? Where are these records? do we have stories in their words? Terry?
In my book, Enslaved on the Trail of Tears, I have been able to come up with a few what I would consider first or second person interviews. One in particular, and correct me if I'm wrong, Angela, it was a Mary Grayson who indicated her mother, Molly Perryman. I wish I had my book in front of me. Her mother ran and hid because she heard that she was about to be sold. And she went and hid in this little clay pit where they used the material to make clay pots. And when they found her, she was like 12 years old. They sold her to this man, this Creek named Perryman. Well, during the course of him owning her, he discovered as a 12-year-old girl, she was not capable of having children. So he sold her to someone else. And then that person discovered, again, he was not childbearing age, therefore she was no value to him. And eventually sold him to this guy named Mose Perryman. Following that, her husband, I believe it was Perryman's, this was coming up on the period of the Civil War. And her husband with his brothers started scheming how they were going to escape and go join the troops in order to fight. Well, realizing, I hope, that he was putting his family in peril, because once the owners, Mose Perryman, found out, he came through the slave quarters in a fit, threatening to kill everybody because he lost his valuable property. And after that, they traveled across country trying to find refuge in another place. I believe they came south where the Chickasaws were to hide out during the war. Eventually, the war had ended, and she was trying to make her way back home. Sent word to, I think, Fort Gibson, where word was that her husband had been there. And he got word when they finally reunited. He was able to tell his family and his children that he fought in the Battle of Honey Springs. Now, this is a fabulous story, and it's all contained in the Indian Pioneer paper. And it's gems like that that I had to really dig for, because these stories just don't pop out the page. Nobody's really writing about them. And so it takes researchers to look at this information. It takes an established researcher to really look for this kind of information to write about this history. And I think that's part of the impetus. And another part of that story I didn't say. You will recall, Angela, we were at the, the Indian tribe, 5 tribes, storytelling conference.
Storytelling conference, yes.
And the historian for the Creek Nation, Joyce Bear, she made this remarkable statement about how her grandmother told her about the Trail of Tears and how they experienced all of this loss and all of this pain. And it triggered in me, well, what about this story of this little girl who was owned by a Creek, who was sold from guy to guy to guy because she couldn't have a baby for them? That pain is not talked about. That pain is not commemorated. That pain of that innocent child is not remembered by that tribe. So there's an injustice not only in what was done, but there's an injustice in the history that's spoken. And so, again, we get back to what I'm going to preach it till we get tired of it.
There you go.
We have to own our narrative, and this is the place where I start. That I don't know it all, and I probably will take the rest of my lifetime, however long that is, to learn about this subject. But there's enough to tell me that there are more stories like that need to be discovered.
There has to be, which is critical. And I hope the audience is hearing this, but also if you have questions, put them in the chat, put a Q in front of your questions, and we'll get to them when we're done with the discussion. Yes. And Angela, am I hearing a little more than just survival? Am I also hearing resistance on these families?
Oh, absolutely. There was resistance. And again, this is now not during the migration. They had no choice. They were all being transported, even the slaveholders. Of course, many of them were signers of the treaty saying, oh, yeah, we'll go west. But the families, of course, were survivors. But what you do see resistance, though, not too long after arrival in the West. And now Choctaws came first in the early 1830s. Cherokees coming later, latter part of the 1830s. One of the wealthiest slaveholders at that time, Joseph, known as Rich Joe Van, and he owned a good number of slaves. 1842, shortly after arrival in the West, there was the big Cherokee slave revolt, where a good number of enslaved people enslaved by Joseph Van, locked everyone up in the house around 2 or 3 in the morning, took all the horses, took all the weapons, and they did not do any bodily harm to the family. But they headed what they thought was going south to Mexico. They had several days of travel, and eventually, however, when they had stopped in a place that was also very, very dry, not much water, the children and the women began to suffer dehydration, what have you. But there had been a fight that had ensued between those who were chasing the enslaved people to get back their property and those who were trying to flee to Mexico to find freedom. 6 years later, of course, they were captured, taken back. Some of them had to work on Joseph Van's boats. After that, the leaders of the insurrection were executed, and the remainders had to work on his boat, the Lucy Walker. Some of them died with the master when his boat exploded. He was known for sort of a habit of being very flamboyant and excessive drinking, and he died in an explosion on the Mississippi River. 6 years later, Seminole Nation, another group of people who had been haunted by slave catchers, Seminoles, in 1848, had not long arrived in the territory. They made a dash for Mexico. They had to go southward, in through Texas, in through Apache country, in through some hostile communities, tribal communities, but they made it to Mexico. And many stayed until after the Civil War, came back, settled in South Texas, Brackettville, Texas. In 1861, not far from my hometown in western Arkansas, in Fort Smith, a slave uprising in the Choctaw Nation. There was resistance, absolutely. You had runaway slave ads appearing in tribal newspapers. 1850s, you see, hey, help me catch this runaway, in the Choctaw Intelligencer, which was a bilingual Choctaw English newspaper. There was resistance, continual resistance. People wanted to be free. But the other part was, well, why did they come back? Well, first of all, once they were freed people, don't forget their culture. At this point, generations they had been living in Cherokee culture, within that culture, Choctaw culture, Chickasaw culture, Muscogee Creek / Seminole culture. This was what they knew. Indian Territory was their home. You see, there's one letter that I found. You don't find a lot from Indian Territory in the Freedmen's Bureau, but I did find a poignant letter. And it is, by the way, in my latest book coming out, you'll find a copy of the letter. I know, shameless self-promotion. Forgive me.
Promote. We need this.
But one of the things that you find in that letter to the Freedmen's Bureau, several people from different tribal communities. I can think Week Baldridge. There were some people from Gardner, from Choctaw Chickasaw country, saying, hey, we want to get back to our wives and our families, our children, but we've been threatened that if we show up in our Union Army uniforms, we're going to be shot. And many people who ended up in my ancestral community in Scullyville, they had come from Chickasaw Nation because they were being terrorized by their former enslavers who just were livid that now they were free. They had to sign a peace treaty with the United States because the slaveholders had fought for the Confederacy. There were over 20 Confederate Native American units during the Civil War. There were only 3 Union regiments, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Indian Home Guards. But the 20 plus definitely Confederate-sided Native tribes. And many people don't know that part of Civil War narrative. Yes. We have to tell our stories. It is ours to.
If I may add.
Go ahead.
Because during the course of my research, I looked at resistance in a couple of ways. And first, I was fortunate to become familiar with some of Dr. King's work.
Sorry for that noise.
In his work, he had a bunch of newspaper articles of runaway slaves, and this was during the removal. So you had slaves running away while on the Trail of Tears. That was their resistance. But then when I look at the story of the enslaved people and I put it under the lens of resistance, their survival and resilience is itself the story of resistance. They
Absolutely.
resist to die on that trail. They resist to die during slavery. They resist to die in many ways and yet still raise a family. In some cases, they did tell these stories to their children who remembered it and were able to be tell it 100 years later
Yeah.
after the event. So that resistance manifested itself in a lot of different ways when we talk about the Trail of Tears.
So both of you have commented on different records and resources from your research, be your family and this, that, and other. What are some examples that the audience can take away as where to look for these type of records, and what kind of information can we find on these records? And that goes for both of you. You know, I heard census or I heard the Indian papers and so forth.
Let me begin with that, because there was a certain methodology I had to employ in order to even discover these names of these people who were nothing more than a tick mark or a number. And I began years ago doing community research of the Chickasaws and Choctaws, and I kept noticing certain ages of people. So for me, the first record that would indicate people being enslaved on Trail of Tears is the Dawes card. People tend to look at it in a way that, how can I get enrolled? How can I get in citizenship? I've always operated on a different level because I say if I'm researching that community, I'll find my people in it. So I never really focused on my family. It was the bigger story that always intrigued me. I enjoyed the nature of that puzzle. The other records that are generated from reading the Dawes card, it becomes the Indian Pioneer Papers, the Congressional Record, the census records, the 1835 Cherokee census, the muster rolls that are also contain certain information, letters written and letters received, the M234 records. Fortunately, a lot of this stuff is starting to be digitized, but it's still like the old days. I mean, I'm not telling my age, and I'm not going to tell on you guys, but we do come from a generation that is familiar with the microfilm. And our records have been slowly going through the microfilm in order for us to write about these stories, to have this amount of information, to even have a story. Now that's changed, but the record sets are just enormous, and there are some that I don't know about. The probate records. I was fortunate enough to be shared a probate record by Dr. Elena Roberts. And for some reason, Andrew, you know what I say, things come to you when you need them. I don't know why she shared it with me, but I have an idea why she shared it with me. In it, it was about one of the persons that brought over 400 people west to Indian Territory, Benjamin Love. Of the more than, I think it was almost 500, 492 people. The majority of those people were enslaved people. The reason why I bring that up is because Benjamin Love, the probate record, had in it a gifts that he was giving to his children, and the majority of his children were female. And so in that record, there was several names that I was familiar with from doing this research. One was Margaret Ann and her child. Another was Sarah and her child. Well, again, these are people without a last name, but I associate the two people, Sarah and Margaret, as people who directly said they came west with the Indians. And so, and I was familiar with the research of both. So when I saw this record, I could do a bunch of correlations and records and come up with that one.
Well, talk about those skills there. I hear it.
Well, Margaret Ann was my great-great-grandmother. And Sarah, who was also probably the great-great-grandmother of Dr. Robert. And I could make the association, one, that there was some kind of correlation or relationship between the two. in a lot of ways, when you do community work, how are these people in that same household not knowing one another? And two, when the records are generated through the DAWS cards and the probate record, now we can come together and say, not only are they related, but they also corroborate the fact that they were part of the Trail of Tears. It's records like this that need to be scrutinized differently. We look at it just on face value, but I've been blessed, I guess, with a curious mind to say that there's more to the story when you read between the lines.
That's right.
So Angela, you want to comment on some of the records and resources you've used within your research also?
Oh, absolutely. And of course, just like Terry, of course, I began with Dawes records. And in those days, it was just microfilm. There was nothing in color. Of course, in the last 12 or so years, we've had the color images that we use all the time. But there were the records that preceded the Dawes era. If you're looking at Cherokee Freedmen records, you have the Wallace roll from 1890. You have the Kern Clifton roll that added people who were missed in the Dawes roll. You have also the 1880 authenticated Cherokee census. In the Choctaw and Chickasaw Nations, you have the 1896 roll. You have the 1885 Choctaw Chickasaw census. But there are earlier rolls that you can find sort of, I won't say hidden, but you've got to learn how to look within the Ancestry Native American collections. There's a collection called U.S. Marriages and census records. And there's about 5 or 6 collections on Ancestry that always begin with Oklahoma and Indian Territory. But within those, you can find earlier rolls. I have rolls as early as 1867 among newly freed Choctaw people. And at the top of those records, you'll say to whom they belonged before emancipation.
Wow.
And it gives the name of the slaveholder, and it gives the nationality of those freed people. So sometimes you'll see black and red, or red and black. Sometimes you'll see Chickasaw, and some were identified as Choctaw, and so on. But there are numerous early records, and these are very important. But there are also some records, pre-removal records. There's the Armstrong roll, which was a census taken before the Choctaws went west. We're in the 1830s now. We also can look at other documents. The congressional record is full of things. For example, today in the Seminole Nation, you have the 2 freedmen bands, Dosa Barker's band, Caesar Bruner band, but they were known at the time of removal as the Jim Lane band, the John Brown band. And Caesar Bruner, who became a leader in the Seminole community, and keep in mind, Seminoles are basically culturally Creek people. They're Muscogee people. And his full brother, same mother, same father, was Pero Bruner, another leader. In fact, his image is on the back of Terry's book coming out. And but you do find these other records in the congressional record, for example. Don't forget, of course, military, because many people who were people of African descent enlisted in the Union Army, many in the Indian Home Guards, many in the U.S. colored troops. Also, among both Creek and Seminole, you have the claims records, people who were claiming for lost property during the war, claims of loyal Creeks. Out of 1,100 people in the Creek loyal claims, the first 300 or so were people of African descent who were claiming. And one of my very favorite people, of course, Sugar George. But there's so many remarkable stories. They're the claims of the loyal Seminoles as well. So there are all kinds of incredible records that one can look at. And of course, as Terry has found, muster rolls of Chickasaws being removed and the names of enslaved people, or the situations where some, including children, died during that removal. So there are numerous records that are there that one can look at. And on one of my blogs, I even list several of the pre-Dawes records by tribe. And so...
And what's the name of the blog?
One is called Choctaw Freedman Legacy, and the other one is African-Native American Genealogy. And you can find those, just a Google search, and you can find the two.
And I will make a quick side note here that both of you are instructors at the Midwest African American Genealogy Institute on the American Indian or Native American I'm going to say series. There's 12 sessions. So I'm going to plug that right quick. So
Thank
you
you.
both are teaching this in
Yes.
track 3. So
Yes.
again, thank you for that. So I have
Shelley,
another question.
Shelley, before you go
And
there,
oh,
let me
go
add
ahead.
something because I think it's important to the story of enslaved on the
Sure.
Cherokee. One of the important records, one that I found just fascinating. We talk about enslaved people being numbers and tick marks. Well, for the
Sure.
Seminole Nation, because of their war with the United States, the 3 Seminole Wars, which some people described in newspapers as the Black Negro Wars.
Mm.
Well, because of that very nature of their conflict with the United States, it generated a record called the Captured Negroes of the Seminole
Oh,
Nation. And this is probably the most remarkable record because it actually names people, gives their ages and their family associations and their person that they were enslaved by, which is kind of a dubious term when you're talking about the Seminole Nation. But in that record, that there was well over 100, 150 people, all by name, and this is in 1837. So this is like 60 years before the Dawes Cards, and this is why it's important
Yes.
because now I have a record with a name. I have an age of an individual, and if I look at that Dawes card for the Seminole Nation, can I make a match to that individual? If not, and where it gets tricky, if it's not on the front of the card, it's on the back of the
on
card.
the back.
So the names that I have been able to determine and put in the book is not all of the names that should be in the book. You know,
Yeah.
I just erred on the side of caution, something that I could prove, as opposed to maybe later I'll go back and dig a little deeper and see what else I can prove.
Okay, you both are going to enjoy this question. And again, open discussion.
But
There
we'll let you
is,
out
and
here.
it's still to this day, a lot of African American families that have oral history of having Native American in their lines. I grew up with the story of the Blackfoot tribe, this, that, and the other. And the DNA didn't show forth of the Blackfoot Indians and also location of where they're at. How do we help people get started if they do think they have Native American ancestry in their tree, even before thinking about the Trail of Tears? Where would we first just go? Because we've got this oral history. Angela?
Well, one of the things I always want to say, do not abandon standard genealogical methodology. Do not abandon it. You start with yourself and you work back one generation to the generation that preceded it. You do not start out forgetting grandma, great grandpa, great great grandpa, and you're just going to go and pull up an Indian roll and say, oh yeah, grandma Henrietta Jackson, she had that long hair and those high cheekbones. Well, cheekbones are not a qualification for anything but just your genetics. That's all. It's just reflecting. People in many parts of the world have so-called high cheekbones, and there's no such thing as low cheekbones. But do not abandon standard genealogical methodology, meaning not only connecting one generation to the previous generation, but also studying the geography, the historical geography. Your people lived in Giles County, Tennessee. Why are you grabbing people who lived in Montana and claiming them as your own? Yeah, we're a full-blooded Blackfoot. Well, Blackfoot people have never left Montana. They're still there. So study the people who were traditionally in that part of the country. It does not mean that you don't have a connection, but do not just grab something because you want to prove the Indians so badly. You're going to hijack another community that lived nowhere near your ancestral community. I think it is important, however, also to ask certain questions. And one of the things that I talk about, well, why was an ancestor said to have been of Native ancestor? Some people say, well, my uncle so-and-so was full blood. Well, that means that Uncle so-and-so's parents had to be full for him to have been full. But why are you singling out this one ancestor who had a certain look? Genealogy is not about look. Tribal connections are not necessarily about look. We're talking about a people immersed in a culture, in traditions, and believe it or not, there is a paper trail. They did leave records. Now, some people will jump and grab a name off the Dawes Roll, but their people never lived west of the Mississippi. And I've had people say, yeah, there's my ancestry. See, Eliza Jordan, there she is. Oh, tell me about Eliza. Where'd she live? Oh, she lived in Macon, Georgia. Okay. And you
Flag.
don't want to,
Yeah.
that's abandoning genealogical methodology. If your family is always in Georgia, then research the people who are in Georgia. Georgia was also an ancestral home of Creek people, but sometimes that native ancestry may be further back, and meaning back in a further generation. In addition, keep in mind something else. Sometimes that native ancestry sometimes got passed down through a person who was white. Now, what does that mean? That means a person who may be a third or fourth generation from a colonist from the 16 or 1700s who had a child with a native woman, but that mixed blood offspring continued to marry within a European cultural context. Now, this person's still carrying the DNA of their parents forward, they were still Southerners, became slaveholders, and suddenly slips into the slave quarters, has a child with an enslaved woman, or I'll say left his DNA there. But in many cases, that person, when they do that first DNA test, they have more European because of that, hair texture or that light skin complexion. Don't abandon genealogical methodology.
Amen.
You've got to do it. Don't just go grab an Indian because you want to find the Indian more than anything else. Keep in line with standard methodology, because that will keep you on the right path. Study the community. Who lived near your ancestral community? You think you found someone who was on a Chickasaw roll, but your family actually came from Southern Virginia. That's not the ancestral community of Chickasaw people, but there were native people who did live there. Who were they? Find the right community. But you don't want to go and grab something because you're determined to prove that great grandma who lived in the 1890s was part of a community that had already left the Deep South and been in the West since the 1830s. So it's very important. Don't abandon standard genealogical methodology.
So another comment here. Go ahead, Terry.
To add to what Angela's saying is, it's the very nature of them abandoning genealogical research that people find themselves in that predicament. Because you cannot tell me, with the records that we have available to us as part of the freedmen of the 5 civilized tribes, they cannot either support that accusation that they had a parent or an ancestor that was part of a tribe with Indian ancestry, or they don't. The information is there. The other part of it that I constantly come across is, because the nature of our records, it's funny, if it's to be proven, it's funny how people will dismiss what is actually supporting it.
Right.
Because it's there, and we have this problem where the Dawes Commission, the history of racism within the tribes, and that commission worked against anyone who proclaimed to be a descendant of a recognized lineal descendant of one of the tribes. Okay, so I think, again, going back to standard genealogical methodology.
So a comment here.
Let it go.
And we have these challenges with just specifically African American or American research, period. And again, I love the fact that both of you are bringing this out. It's not that it's complicated. It's just simply following, I'm going to say, the rules per se. Start with the basics and keep going. So why is understanding the Trail of Tears essential for descendants today? Especially those researching their identity and their belonging.
Lord, thank you for that question.
I thought you'd like that.
I maintain that people who descend from a freedman of Indian territory has more records that establish them as part of the 5 tribes than anybody ever can imagine.
Yeah.
because not only are people looking at that Dawes card to try to say, well, we're part of this tribe, but let's take it back. You said, why is the Trail of Tears so important? Well, the records indicate, they show, they demonstrate, they confirm that we were there before the Trail of Tears.
Yeah.
So for you to dismiss that evidence, and when we look at the records of the muster rolls, that they people who were traveling west, and we're there as well. When we look at the records that were created all along the route from Alabama through Arkansas to Indian Territory, we were there. When we look at the records of the Civil War and those people who part of the Dawes Commission's work was to establish a person, if they left territory, they came back within a certain period of time. They had to determine if these people had a history
Yeah.
with the tribes. That is established in these records. It's established from the point of origin, which is beginning and before the Trail of Tears. So when it comes to establishing our credibility as part of the culture, the history, and in some cases, the DNA of these tribes, it begins with the Trail of Tears. And when these tribes sit up and try to ignore that, to deny it, and we see that right now in the Creek Muscogee Nation, that if they really look at their history, there's no way in the world they could deny those people's citizenship.
To highlight that.
Go ahead.
For those who don't understand what's happening in the Creek Nation, Creek freedmen descendants filed a lawsuit within their tribal court. Now, remember, these are 5 tribes that speak to their sovereignty as a sovereign nation. They have a tribal system. The tribal court approved the case of the freedmen descendants. The treaty is still in effect. They have a right to citizenship. This is the Muscogee Creek Nation Supreme Court, the highest court in their nation. The sitting chief has told the citizenship office, don't process these applications. Several thousand people have submitted their applications in an effort embracing a colonizer's spirit of, let's keep these Black people at a distance.
Right.
This person has basically said, we're going to ignore what the courts say. Several thousand people, and I see the names of some people even in the chat room who are citizens, who are plaintiffs in that lawsuit. And the current chief is basically doing a George Wallace standing in front of the courthouse symbolic gesture. Don't let them in. It is racist. It is evil.
Right.
Yes, I said it. And this is something basically, well, as Terry and I were in the, and so was Rhonda Grayson, I see, she's one of the plaintiffs in the Creek Nation case.
Right.
And, but we sat in a room on Capitol Hill, and we sat there listening to the Choctaw representative tell the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, oh, this is not about race. This is about blood, with a room full of Black people sitting behind him. And of course, none of those freedmen descendants had a voice. It was just, the selected voices. And, but we were not among the selected. And at the same time, at the present time in the Muscogee Creek Nation, the current chief, who does not want those Black people anywhere in his space, not on his watch, this is his sort of, okay, I'm gonna do the George Wallace thing, sort of figuratively, standing in front of the courthouse door, where he's telling the citizenship office that people have taken their pictures for their IDs. They are citizens. They have documented proof of their ties. Right. Don't let those Negroes in the door. That is essentially what is happening right now. But it's also happening in other tribes as well.
I was going to ask that.
The Chickasaw representative, well, we've never recognized the freedmen. Well, that's interesting. In the 1870s, they passed actually a resolution to give them citizenship. Fast forward a few years. Oh, no, we're not going to do that. Let's try and get all these people out of the territory. Keep in mind, these are Southerners. Southerners. They had Southern religion practices, farming practices, Black slavery, and Southern sentiments towards the people they had once enslaved. And so they don't call Southern Oklahoma Little Dixie for nothing. And so it's really, really amazing just to see the history. But our point is that we're taking the emotion out. We're
Mhm.
finding the names of our people. They are our people. They are our people who are Choctaw
Yes.
people, who are Tatalusa, who do speak Chatanumpa. They do speak the traditional language.
Mhm.
And again, as the 20th century came around, the elders, some of whom were still alive when I was a child, my great grandmother, who was on the Dawes Roll, I knew her. She was still fluent in Choctaw. And
Mhm.
she, of course, didn't talk about certain things about her life because she came through trauma when her own uncle was the only person put on trial for something that had happened when his four Choctaw compatriots were pretty much let go. And she
Mhm.
didn't speak to that trauma, but that was still her culture.
Sure.
And
Sure.
so we speak to that. We speak to that now. My book about the community in Scullyville and that old community, because they were Choctaw. 3 years ago, the chief wrote an open letter. Oh, we're going to consider citizenship for the freedmen. But then 2 years later, well, I didn't get that many letters. Didn't get that many letters. Did you get any letters? Those of us who have written letters to the current assistant chief are supporting that sentiment to open up the door to discuss it. We never even got a thank you for your letter. We never even got acknowledged. But you know what? We still are going to tell our stories anyway,
Gotcha.
because that's why what we do is so very, very important. So anyway.
So
If I may,
what?
Shelley, I have to make this
Go
point because
ahead, and then
it
y'all
also
gonna let
goes.
me get this next question in before we
Well,
close this out.
we got
Go
more
ahead.
time, right? We got more time.
We got a little more time.
No, another reason why it's important, and it occurred to me because there's a frustration I have right now,
Yes.
and that's
Yes.
because several years ago, Dr. Daniel Littlefield gave a presentation before the National Trail of Tears Association.
Oh,
And
okay.
in that presentation, he took them to task,
Yes, we
spanked them
do.
upside down for their neglect of including people of African descent in them telling the Trail of Tears story. They honor plaques, they honor spaces, they put up all these things to say the Trail of Tears. And he said, you are not including the significant portion of that population that came west. Now, my frustration with the National Trail of Tears Association is they're still resisting that to a great degree, as
Yeah.
far as I can see. And so that importance of having this story and these people be a part of what they are doing is necessary. And it's past time that they take note of this. Uh-oh, you're muted, you're muted, you're muted. Come on.
Oh,
Okay,
we can't hear you, Shelley.
it's the Angela and Terry hour.
Well, hopefully Brian or someone, one of our tech people, can do that. I see a
Yes,
question.
Carmela.
Carmela wants to know if we've been able to find those names passed on the Trail of Tears or document. Terry?
Yes, I have. I, I I have been able through my methodology come up with at least 400 people who I can determine were participants, and I use that word loosely, participants in the Trail of Tears.
Yes.
I firmly believe there are probably at least half to twice that amount that are should be in addition to it. I just haven't had the time, resources in order to really put that work together. But yes, I can give you names, chapter and verse. Okay, because one of the things that really piqued my interest after listening to Dr. Littlefield, because when he said the Trail of Tears Association is not bringing these people within their realm of influence, was that he also says, when are you going to do it? So I'm listening to that and said, well, why don't I do it? Okay. So I took the initiative to start looking at things, but I had already been seeing these things before, that we had all these people who you could name as possibly being on Trail of Tears. But what really caught my eye is, Angela, you know, I have a reputation for downloading the internet.
Yes, you do.
So
Yes, you do.
in my effort to download the internet, I kept coming across these oral interviews, or the summary of the
Yes.
oral interviews, to be more accurate.
Yes.
And in those summaries, occasionally you get a, a, a sentence that says, I came west with the early settlers. I came west with the Indians. And that's telling me directly. Now, they may not be able to tell me what happened to them on that trail, but they are telling me they were involved in it.
Yes.
And with that information and the fact that there's being a neglect shown not only by the tribes and the Trail of Tears
Correct.
and all these other acronyms,
Yes.
that this history is being dismissed, omitted, and minimized,
Mm.
marginalized, that to me it's important. It's
That's an
important
interesting
before,
question
but
also for
it's
you,
important
Terry.
for people like Rhonda. It's important for people, and I have to give a shout out to okay, I forget Lindsay's first name, right? Sharon Lindsay.
Sharon Lindsay Scott.
Sarah Lindsay Scott was a fighter for Creek Freedmen, and I'm so sad that she's not around to see what's happening now. But it's individuals like that that need support. They need these type of records in order to make their case. And we have to support each other in that
Yes.
endeavor, because it is important that if no one else picks up our narrative, we do.
Don't disconnect it.
So
We hear you, Shelley.
I'm it's like everything else. Who are the early people who were significant in this story? And what have they contributed to us getting to this point? Well, our ancestors, they were very significant. They were resilient. They were survivalists. They were fighters. And all along, they did that. So we now have the benefit of their story. That's why those on the enslaved on Trail of Tears, that's why it's important.
Yes.
It's important for me to understand my ancestors, because one of the things that really kept me going when I was getting frustrated was I was always trying to search for the voice of my great grandmother. Everybody else has got somebody written down for them. They got a USCT Civil War participant, but I'm always looking for this fighter, Betty, in her voice. And it's been very difficult to find her speaking for herself. Well, now I'm speaking for her and her mother and those who came before me. When I see people in the census record that says they were born in Africa, I have gone to another level.
Yeah.
And that's what keeps me going.
So, there's another question there, and thank you. I made it back and stuff. So, have you guys been able to find a state or will documents of the tribes pre-removal in their lands?
I will refer to a document. It's not an estate record, but it's sort of a history within the Chickasaw community. As you know, Presbyterians were wonderful missionaries. And in northern Mississippi, not too far from where Holly Springs, Mississippi is now, there was a mission, a Presbyterian mission known as Monroe Mission. And the papers of Monroe Mission, you can actually read some of them. Just do a Google search. You may be able to find some information. But one of the documents refers to, some enslaved people who were enslaved within a Chickasaw community. One is the story of Dinah, an enslaved woman, an enslaved Black woman who was fluent in both Chickasaw and English. And when Reverend Gunn, who was one of the pastors among the missionaries there, and he was so impressed with her linguistic skills, he actually paid her to interpret the word, the Bible, to the Chickasaw people. He paid her, and she saved her money enough to purchase her own freedom, later the freedom of her husband as well, and which is just an amazing story. Now, this is not a will, but this is a record from a Presbyterian mission. But there are other types of things, and sometimes we have to look in unusual places to find more information. Now, people think, probate records, wills, last will and testament. Well, the fact is that they were not the courthouses that people think of in terms of the culture that was being established in the colonies. So people who lived within their tribal community didn't have courthouses and leave probate records per se. So you're not just going to be able to walk into Tippah County, Mississippi, and say, can I see the Native American wills? Well, you're not going to necessarily find that. But on the other hand, among some of the early records that you might find, you may find some of the slaveholders because they were mixed blood. They were the offspring of their white colonizer father and their native women. Oftentimes, the leaders who went west during the migration, they were bilingual, bicultural, biracial slaveholders who were very much mixed blood people who had definitely embraced this institution. This slavery thing is not bad. We can go and build some farms, and these other folks over here will do all the work. So it's important to really understand that. And I think it's important to realize this is why once we get past those basic genealogical records, the census records, Dawes records, pre-Dawes records, we have to now go back into the communities where individuals lived. If there are records created during the removal, let's take a look at them, a close one. I know Terry, through one of our weekly genealogical chats. I think you utilized it in your book, the one of 2 children who had died on the trail. There is, and I think Brian wanted to know, were there any such stories? One story actually came from a slaveholding family in not the WPA, but in the Indian Pioneer Papers, that 116 volume set, where she talked about the child who was run over by the wagon, and then how he lived maybe another day or so before the child died. This little black child, as she called him, the little Negro. But we have to go all over the place to find some of these stories after we go through those basic records.
Genealogical records, yes.
But wait, there's more.
Well, and Brian, did you have a question? Because if not, I have the last question for them.
I wanted to build off of something that Angela had just said.
Okay.
One, it's a huge series of books. They're called the Moravian Missionary
Yes.
Papers. Invaluable for my own research in North Carolina and Georgia,
Yes.
Specifically with my Van family. So same family as the gentleman that you mentioned. He's not my ancestor. He's like an ancestral uncle of some.
Wow.
But Moravian Papers, I posted information about that in the chat.
Great.
And as you were saying about probate records, what I really noticed, and that was actually my question, you lined that up perfectly. So I descend from families like Bailey, Harlan, Mendenhall, Starr, West. So they all started off, my lot started off as Quakers, became Indian traders, then in Pennsylvania, moved into Virginia and North Carolina, decided to become enslavers, where they had never been enslavers before, married indigenous women, largely from the Cherokee, but sometimes the Choctaw. They did leave wills. And I'm really happy that you spoke about the difference between those who were mixed, I call them Anglo-natives, as opposed to those who were not. And I was always really curious, well, did they adopt that European habit of leaving probate records? And it doesn't appear that they did. So thank you for pre-answering my question.
Thank you.
Let me squeeze in these 2 points to go to the question of records prior to the removal.
Prior to.
Well, Angela mentioned the Monroe Mission Church record. Well, one of the things that, again, the story, I recognize it's been working on me for my very first visit to the Oklahoma Historical Society. When I got on the payphone, this is before the era of cell phones, I got on the payphone and talked to Angela. Well, during that visit, one of the librarians came up to me with this loose leaf book of that document. And in it, in 1837, the church was giving documents for people who were going to be removed to Indian Territory with a paper that would allow them to join another church in the territory. Well, in that document, in that church minute, it listed the name of the enslaver, Tennessee Bynum, and all of the enslaved people who were going with her by name. Now, to say that, to say this, one of the records that we failed to tell everybody about, Angela, because it's like our little secret, Don Martini out of Faulkner, Mississippi, he did his own self-publishing little index, or to me, it's a resource book. And in it is, let me get the title, it's Who's Who Among the Southeast Indians. Okay?
Who's who?
I want to get the correct title, because if anybody can find it, it's a good resource to have. Who Was Who Among the Southern Indians, a genealogical notebook from 1698 to 1907. Well, in here, they will give you the sources of information. And in some cases, you will see sources that are probate records or land deeds. And this is another part or aspect of the book that we haven't gotten into, is that these land deeds and these probate records a lot of times will list by name the enslaved people who were being bequeathed to some child of an enslaver. One of the stories that I tell, and one of the stories I get into about what I think is a very important part of the story, is that the women who were enslavers, and you will see a lot of
Also,
time. Well,
the women
within
were
the nation,
enslavers too.
oh yeah, but
Yes.
just not a story that's being told,
Right.
especially when it comes to the five tribes, because it was their way of maintaining generational wealth through the family, and women benefited
They have
a
money.
lot. Yes. Okay. So one of the documents that I found was the two Susans. Okay. And they were being given slaves by their father by name. So
Mhm.
when you're talking about documents that preceded the Trail of Tears,
Before the removal.
they're out there. You just have to know where to look for it. And I think that's part of a genealogical methodology research, is that you have to
And,
know how to research properly in order to get to the point where you need to be.
and we're seeing some commonality here, just researching African Americans
Yes.
and then researching African Americans as far as the Trail of Tears and this whole removal. You're talking about some of the same records. And again, it goes back to the point of always stick to the basic genealogical
Me too.
research,
Yeah.
and the questions will come from that. So, one last question for you guys. We've answered the audience questions and so forth. So, one last question for you, and then we'll close this out. So, my question is, and I'll start with you, Terry. What advice would you give to someone just beginning to explore a possible connection to the Trail of Tears or the freedmen of the five civilized tribes?
Read my book.
There you go. And what's the name of your book?
Enslaved on the Trail of Tears, Race, Removal, and
Awesome.
the Transformation of Indian Territory. I mean, come on.
Okay.
Well,
And it's coming out this
but
month.
I say that in all seriousness because as I
Sure.
was writing it, yeah, I want to tell the stories. Yeah, I want to dig into the records, but
Yeah.
I also wanted it to be a resource for people to continue the work that I've started. I've only touched the surface,
Yes.
and by no means have I gotten everything that there is to talk about. And I'm pretty sure I missed a lot, but it's a resource. In it, I give you some appendix that will list the names and from what tribe, and in a couple of cases, who enslaved them. People need to read that. And if
Yeah.
you have
Yes.
someone, an ancestor that's associated with that tribe, that individual, you need to pick up the work. Terry is, I'm 70-ish. you know,
I'm there with you. Don't worry.
yeah.
You're
And,
among family.
maybe I'll be blessed for another 40 years because I got a lot of work to do. Okay. And yet, other people can do this work as well because I see a lot for other people
Sure.
to do. Just recently, we were talking about uh, a sister, Athena Butler, and the work that she's doing with CCFA. And I am just amazed by her abilities to take a document, create a database that is searchable. And this stuff I've been crawling through for the past 40 years, cranking up the
Yeah.
machines. You know, so it's the next level that people
Sure.
need to take
Sure.
my research, my stories, my book, and make something of it. And
And
don't let it end and begin there. That's
let's
all I
have
got.
questions.
Read my book.
No, I'm gonna let you go, Terry. I'm going to Angela now so she can get her say in before we close out. So, Angela, same question to you.
Well, in terms of giving
Besides,
advice,
buy your book, which is this ship.
absolutely. No, I think in terms of what advice would I give to someone, first of all, explore history in a proper way. History is not explored on TikTok. There are
Right.
there are dozens of people who give themselves exotic sounding names they think are native sounding names. Some crowning themselves, I'm chief this and I'm empress that, and they're trying to hijack history. They're actually going sometimes into traditional spaces, saying you're not who you say you are, although they have, hundreds of years of documented history. History is not found on TikTok in 60-minute sound bites. Really get serious, connect with those who have written. These are people who very much like a gentleman who lives on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., who's going to basically dismiss history. And there are plenty of people who look like us who are dismissing history. Oh, you're just going to believe what they told you. But they're making it up as they're expounding other history. Do not allow nonsense to hijack your history. Our history is not to be hijacked. We can prove who we are. Many of those TikTok historians are individuals who can't even name all four of their grandparents. And that's unfortunate. Hopefully they will be able to do that at some day. But we cannot worry about nonsense. Don't let nonsense into your space. Stay focused, learn the basic methods, and interact with others who can also teach and share and lead you down the right path of research. All of what we do is a form of activism. I know that there's some scholars who believe that those of us researching communities or community history, we're looking for activists, not community researchers or public historians or genealogists. No, we're all on the same team. We're all working
on the same team trying to find our people.
Trying to get the story and get to the story. And we want to tell the story properly. We want to tell it well. It's not going to be found, shouting in a TikTok 60-minute soundbite. Let's get serious and let us tell the story. It is our story to tell.
If I might add, it's important what Angela just said for one real reason, well, two reasons. She alluded to it earlier about the Senate hearing that we attended about 2022. And there was a GAO survey that was generated from that. And I do believe recently where we saw the chief of the Cherokee Nation commission a group to go out and study the effects of freedmen on the Cherokee Nation and how it benefited them economically.
Yes.
So the history is more than just wanting to be a tribal member. It makes you activists, because I don't believe that any other way that the Cherokee chief is the only person who's taking that step. The others are still sitting back in denial when the history is right there in front of them.
And it also might not be denial. It might just be, we don't need to know this.
I'm glad you said that. Because
not to go down another path.
Well, we don't have that kind of time. Is that can also take us places we don't need to go. And again, that brings back the message of stick to what you know and where you're going and those basic rules. We all got 30, 40 years of conducting genealogical research. And you know what? The research covers all different, the way we look. Look at the three of us right now.
Yeah.
It's all going to come to information, records, and so forth. We have got to tell these stories.
But Shelley, I'm glad you said that, because I think one of the things that I have to resolve while writing the book was, am I trying to place blame on the tribes for what happened, or am I trying to make our story above that story? And that's not it. What we're trying to do is because they don't want to hear the story, think what it does to their narrative. They've had the high ground that they suffered, and they have all these commemorations on the Trail of Tears. And if that story of those enslaved people are part of that story, it kind of skews it a little differently in people's perspective of it. And so in a certain way, I'm not trying to hurt anybody, but the truth does hurt sometimes. But the key is telling the truth, being honest with people.
That's all we're saying. We're not, and again, even with slavery, I'm not trying to blame anybody, but I want you to know, and I want to know what they experienced, and I'm here to tell it because they're not. And
Exactly.
again, if we're sitting here, that means your people survived that trail of tears, being enslaved, becoming free, and so forth. And you know what? It's just as good as anyone else's story. So I do want to close
I'm
this out on our
I
time.
just want I just want to
Oh,
hop
Brian?
in real quick. I just want to hop in real quick. We learn about every other people's trauma
Oh,
that, and it was trauma. I'm not saying that it wasn't. That
yeah.
lasted for far less than 400 years. No one wants to talk about ours. That's just I
And,
want
and I'm going to say
Some point.
amen. And today we talked about removal, but also about memory, about
Hmm.
loss, but also about survival and resistance. So, about the records, you heard the name of the records. And Terry, I'm sorry we didn't get to show some of those that you wanted to share, but we will make sure that they're available that people can tap into.
All they need to do is get the book.
They're in the book. You're good. But again, it's not just about the records, it's
No.
not just about the documents. And again, it is the evidence that people lived and they were there. And I talk about Revolutionary War, this, that, and the other. And I'm thinking, you got to recognize that our people were there.
Yes.
So the conversation reminds us that family history is never just personal. It is political, culturally, and deeply human. So, on behalf of the Center for Family History and the International African American Museum, I thank you, Angela and Terry, for spending the afternoon with me, even with our technology challenges. I think you both have provided a wealth of information
Thank you.
Thank you.
beyond these listening walls. So, folks, we invite you to continue exploring the histories, asking hard questions, reclaiming the stories that matter. Our next podcast is going to be May 16th, and it's going to be a little bit on spiritual healing and dealing with trauma and things that you have learned during your research and so forth. So, again, thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we are signing off. Appreciate